Hello and welcome to the Growing Leaders Podcast. Christine, let me just tell you that this podcast exists because the topic of growing a next generation of leaders is really, really important.
It is.
Yeah. So we're going to have a great time today talking about growing leaders in the current landscape, which is a tricky one these days. But I've got a quick exercise to do with you. Are you ready for it?
I'm ready.
All right. I am going to go down a list of characteristics of an older generation and characteristics of a younger generation. And my question for you in these is, as you hear there will be one for each of the generation. As I read those, how would you see each of those relating to Jesus? Real quick. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Like how would that characteristic do at having to follow Jesus? Okay. All right. First one, older generation, rational. Mm-hmm. It's about logic. The next generation, experiential. Okay. So how do you think the older generation would do rational with Jesus? How do you think younger generation experiential would do with Jesus?
I think, well, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
He messed with people's rationale.
Yeah, he kicks your ducks when they get in a row, we've said before.
And he demonstrated things.
Yeah. So demonstrate being experiential, you get to experience
You got to experience. You saw miracles, which is against rationale.
Okay, so wait a minute, though, because I thought the idea is the next generation, it's over for them. They're so messed up. So you're actually saying that's a characteristic that would make them do pretty well with Jesus.
It would, if they were touching real kingdom things.
Yeah.
Then yes, they would do very well.
Okay, well, all right.
In my opinion.
As we say, spicy. Okay.
Spicy.
Next one, older generation. Focus on the scientific, evidence. Next generation, focus on spiritual realities.
Again, I would say people who focus on just the data or like what makes sense logically or scientifically sometimes struggle with kingdom things or supernatural things because you can't define them or prove them. There isn't as much evidence other than that it's spiritual and supernatural. So. All
right. So point for the younger generation in that one. We can make the case that if you really do great science and get into it, then of course God made the universe. It goes there. But I like what you're saying. All right. Here's another one. Older generation focus on exclusivity or exclusive. Younger generation focus on things are relative. Which one would you say? Who wins that?
I mean, it depends on how it's presented, but relative being like agile.
Can be. Really agile.
Really agile.
Like, I love my cat. I go to the church of my cat. I'm just kidding. Of course, there is an agility. You're right. The one thing about exclusivity is it makes you prone towards commitment.
Well, it is. I was going to say, it kind of depends on what we're talking about here. Because if it's like being committed to Jesus, then it's like sometimes Jesus you paint a different picture of Jesus than reality, which the younger generation is guilty of. And then the older generation is very much just committed to biblical truth.
Yeah.
So
committed to biblical truth, committed to a job, committed to a family at times, committed. So that's one where it can go both ways, but at least that's a tie. That may be a little bit to the older generation. Okay. Ready? Individualistic for the older generation was a characteristic. Communal.
I would give it to the older generation.
Whoa, I thought you would go the other direction on this one.
No, well, I think if I'm coming at it from the sense of identity,
okay,
and knowing yourself, I would say that the older generation had a strong sense of self and place in society, culture, family, within a church. Mm-hmm. Whereas sometimes the younger generation, with everything being communal and holistic and like everyone together, it just gets really shallow and weird, and there's no leadership. And then that is my opinion. I know.
I like it. I think you're right. That's an interesting
You can also make an argument in the other direction.
Sure.
And so it really just kind of depends on where your heart is in it.
Basically, at this point, we're pretty close to being tied. So we're going to do one more.
Okay.
Potentially for a tiebreaker. I think you're looking ahead at the list to try to figure out who wins.
No. Well, I keep looking at the list and you keep skipping lines. And so I don't know what you're going to do.
Don't cheat. Okay. Older generation, focus on being relevant. Uh-huh. Younger generation, focus on being authentic. Who does better with Jesus?
Authentic. Because Jesus was real. He didn't care about relevance. He didn't, like, that wasn't ever what he was after. He presented himself, and you either accepted it or you didn't. And then if you didn't, he just walked away. Versus when you're after relevance, you kind of will beat a drum till it's dead.
Okay, I want to just, and we're wrapping this up, but I just want to go ahead and present the other side.
Sure.
Which is relevance is a part of resonance, and it's a part of connecting. It's a part of incarnating and reaching. It's part of contextualizing. So there is an element of being relevant that means you connect. So I think authentic is a pretty good one. I'm going to call it overall a tie, but say authenticity is a good thing to lead. We've said it so many times across this podcast, but if you want to grow next generation leaders, at least, authenticity is like a core piece, isn't it?
It's key. Well, especially because the next generation is after authenticity. They're not always finding it, but they're looking for it. And so if what you present is the real gospel and who Jesus really is and not who you think he is, then it resonates, and it's very relevant to who they are and who they want to be. Yeah,
that's great. All right. So with that, what are we talking about today? What happens next?
So if you're listening to this, you've read the headline, but really what we're talking about is a post-Christian America. What is it that shifted culturally? What is it shifted within generations to where we are now? And then what does it take for the next generation to rise? Today we have Brian Emmet, and yes, we do share a last name.
How'd you do that?
It was a magic trick, or more famously, I married his son.
Oh, that's a good way.
Peter Emmet.
Okay.
But Brian's really great. Brian was a member. He and Kathy, his wife, were members of the Covenant Church in Arlington for about 45 years, but they also pastored the church for the last 23. Recently retired and moved down to North Carolina from Boston to be with some of his other kids, which is really great. It's great to have them close to here in Atlanta. But he and Kathy are really great leaders. They've done a great job at investing in young people. They started a school when their kids were school age, just seeing the need for great education. And that school still exists today. They're up in Arlington, Massachusetts. So when we were talking about what we're going to talk about today, we really couldn't think of anyone better than Brian, who's worked with young people of all ages and leaders across the country. He also has his own business as a personal life coach. That's really great if you're ever looking to talk through stuff with someone. Brian's great with that too.
All right. Well, first question to really ask you about is that I think when most people think about growing leaders today, the reason that they are thinking about it is because they're often struggling with it. There's in the last few years been some tensions between generations, that have been specifically around the political landscape or a different cultural landscape. And so I think the question I'd ask you is there are always kind of tensions between different generations that occurs from time to time. But in this current moment, do you see anything specific as you watch an older generation, a younger generation, as you watch some of the tensions that exist around politics, around big hot button issues? Do you see anything unique to this moment as one generation engages another?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One is just how confusing our moment is. And I suppose everybody feels that way, but we need to pay attention to what's particularly confusing about the times that we live, in which we live. And, with confusion tend to come fear and anger.
Yeah.
So the times we live in are, a combination of confusion, anger, and fear. There's a lot else going on, but I think those are part of what's happening. And part of the confusion is just how rapidly things are changing. And I think for, older leaders, that's one of the hardest things is so much of what my generation would see as fixed landmarks are just floating, apparently floating around or getting submerged altogether or popping up in a totally different way in a totally different location. So I think that's for older leaders, and I'm now old enough that I can remember when I was a teenager, and I grew up during the Vietnam era in the '60s. So another time of cultural
Sure.
confusion and fear and anger. So we are certainly far from the first generation who's lived through fairly rapid and wrenching change. But I think learning to pay attention to what's particularly confusing about the times we live in will help both older leaders and younger leaders learn how to find our way through a pretty chaotic landscape.
Oh, one thing I wanted to ask you about this specific moment, because when you're talking about how rapidly things are changing, one thing that people would say as an option of why that's happening is just technology. We're in a moment where just technology is building upon itself at a really dynamic rate. And then there's another idea that people talk about, which is like Kairos moments, of where there are these massive moments that are shifts. And I could see either as a hypothesis of why this is happening, but what would you say? What would you choose? Or do you have another theory of why it's changing so quickly right now?
Technology is a huge accelerator. The pandemic that we are hopefully emerging from was another tremendous cultural accelerant. I think in some ways, one of the most helpful perspectives on the pandemic for me, sort of from a cultural point of view, is it accelerated things that were already in motion. Church attendance has been declining steadily and is now declining even more rapidly. Technology does open up the possibility of people attending church virtually. But still, the trend lines are down. COVID accelerated that. People of my generation tended to think of in terms of finding a job that became your career, and you kind of did your career for most of your working life. And I think younger people today have to position themselves to, have 2, 3 careers. And I don't mean just jobs, but even job change happens far more rapidly today. It's far more common for, somebody to hold a job for 2 years and then, be looking for the next job or being forced to find the next job because the 2-year job didn't pan out the way they had hoped. So those are a couple of factors. And I think too, from just kind of the way that our academies, our universities influence our culture. So we bandy about terms like critical race theory or gender theory without really understanding a lot about what those ideas are or where they come from. But they have been tremendously influential and in a very, very rapid way. So I think those are a couple of factors. But I think technology, it's an interesting conversation. Does technology, the ways in which technology makes something happen and the way technology accelerates things that are already happening.
Yes, I'm going to go back to one part of that and then hand it to you, Christine, after I ask this question. So the Kairos moment idea is basically that every 500 years there are these massive shifts kind of thing. And I don't know that there's nobody that's proven any kind of piece of this. There are moments that you can point to in those critical moments. But the one thing that we do know is whether you're talking about modernism to postmodernism, or whether you're talking about that when things like technology are causing things to shift so quickly, there are some big moments where part of an iceberg breaks off, or it's different than it is. So some of the things that that we do know have shifted in a major way are the way people think about things, the way people process things, the values that are there, in a way that happened a little bit quicker from one generation to another than the normal handoffs. So when you look at the idea of that there being a bigger shift in this moment, would you say no? Would you say no? I think it's just the way it goes and it's technology. Or have you seen anything that would be larger about this moment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one of the things that's potentially larger about our moment is the collapse of authority structures. So we, somebody did a poll just recently, I forget it was Pew or Gallup, and they asked Americans to rate their confidence in different institutions, Congress, the media, the president, et cetera, et cetera. And most of them were down under 20%. So we really have some challenges about deciding where reliable knowledge comes from. We tend to increasingly distrust institutional authorities. I grew up in the time when we, first started slapping the question authority bumper sticker on our cars. And we've continued to question authority. And so increasingly, I think what's happening for people is, the only authority you trust is yourself. That's why we have such an emphasis on authenticity, making sure that you're being true to yourself, that you are doing yourself in a way that's faithful to your self-understanding. And part of the problem with that is if everybody else is wrong about you, or if everybody else's perspective on you can't be fully trusted, how do you know you can trust yourself and your own perspective on you? So, when it comes to thinking about identity, everybody always finds their identity in something. You find your identity in your work, in your religion, in your ethnicity. So we like to think of ourselves as self-contained individuals. I'm a unique individual. We all want to be a unique individual. And at the same time, we can't help reading a lot of the identity clues about ourselves from other people, right? And if you hadn't ever met me, but you just looked in my clothes closet, you could tell a lot about me just by looking at the clothes that are hanging there. You could probably, even if you'd never met me, you could probably tell, my age, older white guy, whatever, because, so I like to think I'm a unique individual. And, when we go through our times of teenage or adolescent rebellion, right, we're all looking different. We want to look different. We want to separate ourselves from them, whoever them is, but we all look and talk and act like one another. So I think those are some of the things, but I think, questions about what is authority, who has it, how do they get it, how is it exercised well or poorly, is part of what is making things so confusing. And, if the only authority I trust is me, it kind of turns everyone else into a potential threat to my freedom and dignity. Doesn't have to do that, but I think more and more we're seeing ways in which if the only person I can trust, particularly when it comes to the question, who am I really? If the only person I can trust about that is me, and everybody around me is on that same quest, there's not a lot that calls us to cooperate with one another.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of, I wonder if we're, heading for Hobbes's world of the war of all against all. I don't mean a shooting war, but I mean a, kind of identity war.
Well, it feels like that a little bit already. First, thank you again for being here. I think this is a really important conversation. I find it very relevant, incredibly alarming, but really good. And so I think if I am processing this conversation as someone who is a growing leader or potential growing leaders listening to this, but then also leaders who are looking at growing the next generation of leaders, I have a couple thoughts and then some questions. But one, there is an interview with Tim Keller that's really great that we can link later. But he's talking through how the previous generation, the meaning of life is what he says, but really it's like your worldview was shaped around being a good person. And so it's just be a good person. So some of that is informed from having been founded as a Christian nation, like love your neighbor, that kind of stuff. But we've lost a lot of that. And now the mindset is being true to yourself. That is the worldview or the meaning of life is like to be true to yourself, find your true self, which is what you hear thrown around a lot among young leaders. Is like, well, I'm being my true self, which is really just like a justification. It's like, I'm doing what I want because I can, which is alarming. Because the biggest shift culturally, I would say then, is that mindset shift of it being about being good to others and good will happen to you. Instead, now it's be good to yourself because no one else will be good to you.
Right.
And that makes us bad neighbors, bad friends, bad workers in jobs, bad leaders, but then also really bad believers. Because the way Jesus lived had like literally nothing to do with himself. He was a king and he came and was a very lowly person who lived amongst like riffraff, and changed people through it. And that is evangelism. But we're wanting to evangelize people. The current with the current shift in culture, we're coming at evangelism from the myself perspective and how it helps me or benefits me versus the being very, very small so that he can be glorified and someone else's life change. That's very little to do with being a good person and more about yourself. So I find that concerning. And it makes me evaluate my own heart and my own process. But earlier, when you were talking about things have been changing really rapidly, and these big landmarks have changed, how do you want to elaborate, or would you care to elaborate on some of what those landmarks are? Because I think some of these things are like biblical truths that then we've like watered down, because of our true selves or trying to be relevant or some of the cultural shifts. But what are some of the biggest things that have shifted, you think, culturally that are interfering with young leaders or that could get in the way of young leaders that they might get stuck in between like what's relevant now, what was relevant before?
Yeah. But I think the question of identity is a critical one. And I also listened to that Tim Keller interview, which I found really helpful. And as I recall it, I think, you know, at one point we just wanted to be good, and we're pretty confident that we could do that. Then we just wanted to be free, and now we just want to be who we really are. Those are overlapping, but also somewhat distinct. I think the other thing that's going on, we the established order, what we might call the modern world, and politically that would be sort of what some thinkers call the liberal order, not liberal in terms of liberal Democrats versus conservative Republicans, but liberal in terms of individual rights, limited government, constitutional government, rule of law, marketplace of ideas, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, free press, all of those kinds of things are increasingly called into question because they're viewed as systems of oppression. So now, not only do you have to figure out your identity you have to figure out the extent to which you're a member of an oppressor group or an oppressed group. And it just gets very complicated very quickly. And Jamie, I think you might have used the word earlier, it gets exhausting. It's just a never ending struggle to make sure that, you're not only being true to yourself, but you are also contributing to justice and rightness and making the world a better place. all of which can be pretty overwhelming
Yeah.
and confusing.
Yeah, I'll jump in and give our last pass at Tim Keller's podcast that everybody will now go listen to. It's specifically the first 15 minutes that we're kind of touching on. But you're right. He was the Son of God. He was the King of Kings who he came, and he emptied himself because Jesus knew who he was from the beginning. This is my son in whom I'm well pleased, before he ever heads out there. So,
which is his identity piece. Like, identity is key.
Well, that's the point that Keller makes, is identity as a believer, as a follower of Jesus, is something received. He's the one who tells us who we are. He's the one who tells us who he made us to be. And that is really nice, because first of all, he's the right person for the job and he knows what he's doing and he's good at it. And when you don't have to be on that hamster wheel doing something you're not made to do, a little bit like we talked about purpose in our last episode, about when you're not in your purpose, it's harder. Well, establishing your own identity from zero is not really what you were made to do. And it is so exhausting, but it's become the fight. And what's kind of funny is when you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing, if you start to get the mindset, the reason this is hard is because they're making it hard for me, rather than, no, you're just doing the wrong thing.
You're doing it wrong.
It's like I'm going up the down escalator and it's the man who's trying to destroy me. No, you're on the wrong escalator. So first of all, just like what you said, so tiring and so exhausting. Second piece is what you just said, is that then once you've established yourself, exactly what you said, you've got to identify the systems of oppression, and you've got to now establish justice to make sure everything's right. So now you're not only having to build yourself, but you're having to build a perfect world. And that leads to attacking and canceling anything that's not right. As you're watching an older generation relate to a younger generation, what tips would you have, or things that you've seen, whether it's relating to your own children or relating to younger leaders around you in your community? What are some of the things that you've seen of traction points versus friction?
Yeah, I think older people need to get much better at asking questions and listening. But part of being older is you want to tell. And you do have a lot to tell. Hopefully by the time you're 65 or 70, you've acquired some wisdom that really can be helpful to other people, but particularly younger leaders. But I feel a lot of times, everybody's locked up inside in some ways. We have all these chambers in our hearts and souls with locks on them. And the right question at the right time, asked with a really listening heart, unlocks, those parts of our souls. But I think so often, we're using the wrong key. And, when the key doesn't open the lock, then we get out a hammer and start beating on the key,
Yes.
And then when that doesn't work, we get our, big bolt cutters, and try, because we're so wanting to get into that part of a person's life. But, I think part of it's just really slowing down, and, I think one of the questions is, tell me what you're seeing. And tell me why you see it the way you do. So instead of, the older generation seeing itself as possessing, the knowledge, wisdom, and experience, and the younger generation primarily just needing what the older generation has, it really becomes a little more of a partnership. So I do know some things that younger leaders don't know, and they do know some things that I don't know. And they would be helped by learning some of what I know. And I, as a leader, would be helped by learning some of what they know. And it goes deeper than just the standard boomer joke about, I'm a tech nerd or stuff like that. It really, culture changes. It really does.
Yeah.
And it's hard. Uh, Culture is more like a beach. The waves keep coming in, and sometimes when you start to get older, you don't like all the change and all the churn and all the new wave coming in. Um, when you're younger, you tend to like to surf them a lot.
And one thing that you're saying there that strikes me and I think is helpful, I love the thing you're saying about considering it as a partnership. And it makes me think of Philippians 2:6, where it says, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, existing in the form of God," pretty good, "did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being made in human likeness." And here's Jesus, who really could have come and given a pretty significant amount of good lectures that would have been very helpful to all of us. But he comes down and he earns the opportunity. Well, he earns the place in our hearts that follow and listen and choose to follow and listen. And so I like that idea of, like, as you walk into a young person's life and you start to ask questions, you can even ask questions that help you understand where your on-ramp is to be able to build the kind of friendship where they will care, And I think that's really, really powerful, because you could say, well, they're not like Jesus and those jerks, and they should listen to me tell them about Jesus. But if you really realize it, if you listen to that verse in Philippians 2:6, you're not being anything like Jesus in the way that you're beating the tar out of them.
Well, and he did not agree with the lifestyle of a prostitute, but he very much loved her, and her life changed. He didn't berate her and shame her and say, you're doing it wrong, that's not the right way, which is what we do when someone sees things opposite of us.
Which oddly is not attractive.
No.
For some reason, that doesn't work as well.
No war has been won that way.
Well,
he loved
go
well.
ahead.
No, that was it. I was going to say he loved well. He just, he was honest, but he loved well, which is a little bit of what you were saying. It's the listening heart. It's it's the still small voice, and it's relating, and it's conversation. It's not argument and rage.
Yeah, and just to follow along, for the Christian church in the U.S., most of our leadership models come from the corporate world. We really think more in business organizational terms. And one of the things that's encouraging to me is there's a lot of ferment that I see among younger leaders of calling into question some of those old leadership models. And so I think that could be a landmark that is shifting or being reconstructed or moved or whatever. And the other thing, when we talk about identity and, Jesus gives you your identity, I think we need to be careful because people will hear that or can hear that as Jesus just assigning you a slot. You're a number, you're a category, there's your identity. And I think we need to communicate the you that Jesus knows you to be is unbelievable, unbelievably wonderful.
Yeah.
But you don't get that sort of in some kind of divine download. The gift of your identity is something that gets unpacked as you follow Jesus, as you get to know him, as you are learning to move in his ways. So in that sense, your identity is both open in many ways. You don't know who you are yet, but Jesus does. But it's not something that you self-create. You are unpacking in your life the you that Jesus already knows that you are, but you don't yet. And the only way to do that is by living it out. So it's not, and I think that's just a different model of leadership because it means everybody exercises leadership in some way or another. And part of Christian formation is learning the ways in which God works uniquely through you. It doesn't have to look like anybody else. It'll obviously have certain qualities and features in common with other kinds of leadership, but you are both unique in Christ, and you are not totally just on your own to do whatever you want whenever you want to. So it's a both and rather than an either or. Mm-hmm. But I think when it comes to identity, we need to really clarify for people that Jesus doesn't just hand you a ticket, or a punch card or something that just says, sit in this chair, here's what you do. When this happens, raise your hand, end of story.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, the way you just said it, because what happens all the time these days is that there's some partial truth in something that makes you lift up your fists, and you struggle with the way somebody else is telling you, oh, you shouldn't be defining yourself. You need to just, I'll tell you who you are and stuff like that. And then you're right. Then you hear what we're talking about and you're like, oh, that's how God is, or that's how they say this God is. But I think what you're sharing right there, I think for any heart of any age, is they hear what you're saying, it would be refreshing, and there'd be freedom in it, and there'd be life in it. And I think that's the thing that in this generational tension that can happen is the enemy can jump in and start bullying us and pushing us around and even manipulating us into fighting for ourselves or into fighting against somebody else in a way where we lose where Jesus is, which is a lot of the very beautiful Sermon on the Mount things. Love your enemy, or being meek, or doing things where it's very counterintuitive to being in a big fight or turning the other cheek. But there's these ways of getting to go with him that if you go with him, it's what will satisfy your heart. But you can get tricked into these battles for your life that continually alienate you from your own heart or the things you're looking for.
Yeah, one of the I think most powerful questions, and Jesus asked a lot of questions. I think somebody did a study, and there were, in the 4 Gospels, there are over 200 distinct questions that Jesus asks different people at different times. But one of them is right in the start of John's Gospel. John the Baptist and 2 of his disciples are walking along, and John sees Jesus, and he points to Jesus. He says, "Behold the Lamb of God." And so the 2 disciples that had been following John peel off and they start to follow Jesus. And it says, Jesus seeing them. So Jesus sees them. I think people really need to know that Jesus sees them. And he sees them with eyes of love, which doesn't mean that he simply affirms everything about them. And he says, "What do you want?" And I think that's a critical life question. What do you want? And to understand that Jesus isn't obligated to simply give you anything you would come up with in response to that question. But that question, what do you want? And in John's Gospel, those 2 disciples say, where are you staying? It's sort of, they don't know exactly what to do. And then Jesus says, come and see. So I think that dynamic between what do you want and then following Jesus is the way to come and see. Right? So, if you say, Jesus turns to you and he says, "What do you want?" And you say, "I want to be rich and famous." So I think Jesus is going to engage you in a conversation about that, right?
That's right.
And he's going to say, if you want to be great in God's kingdom, here's how to do that. Greatness is before you, but here's how it happens in the kingdom of God. Learn to be the servant of all. Yeah. So what do you want? And I think for, oftentimes Christians, our immediate response is, well, I need to want whatever God wants, which is true. But I think the way that God gets what he wants is by asking us, what do you want? And have that be the opening question in kind of a lifelong conversation.
Yeah.
And that's along the lines of a lot of what we talked about in our last episode with John Jenko.
Yeah, and talking about purpose. Yeah, I really appreciate the way that you said all that. It's really encouraging to recognize how relational Jesus is, how relational God is, how made for relationship we are, and how when we get pulled into real life, real deep, intimate relationship, things start to work better. First of all, with him, of course, but even as we're talking about an older generation learning how to help raise up or grow young leaders, or even a younger generation learning how to grow leaders from their own ranks, the power of relationship is such a big one. We've just gone through so many things that can create acrimony and division and stuff like that. So it's like all of our best tools got moved about 3 feet further away from us. But I appreciate the way that you said that. One of the best things about following Jesus is you do learn how to love and know people and relate. So I think that's an excellent lens to face this entire subject, particularly in this moment. So if this, first of all, Brian, is really, really helpful. It's so great to be able to have you on as often as we can get you. But as you listen to all of that, Christine, what would be your final thoughts or questions or a way to wrap us up?
No, I loved all of that. I think it's really insightful, and I think it's really right. I don't think there's a single person in the world today, or in the United States today, that would say culture hasn't shifted dramatically. And the church has shifted dramatically. There's been a lot of big shifts. What hasn't shifted is the kingdom. Yeah. And so really, how do we, and kind of as I'm thinking of this and kind of sorting through what everyone's saying, I think a takeaway for me is, how do we walk away from, like, everyone was made for great things. Like, God doesn't create us to, like, fail at everything. We're made for great things. But a lot of us get stuck up on our hurts, or where we've been offended, or where something has happened. And then that is the thing we pick up and that's our megaphone. And that's the call for justice within the church and outside of the church. And that's where there's massive division within political parties. And it's like, really the things that both political parties stand for, whether it's justice and equality among all people, races, ethnicities, or against really great government, no government overreach, and like people's rights. Those are all of those things are great. But what's greater is the Lord's will and purpose for us. And what's greater is him wanting to heal where we've been hurt. And what's greater than that is him wanting us to just turn and love our neighbors. Real justice, that is where it will be served, is in us just putting down our right to be angry about what's happened to us and going and loving the person next to us or the person we disagree with, like Jesus did with everyone he encountered in the New Testament. He was mocked, he was spat on, but who he was, his identity didn't change, and so he had to live through it. And then you have to like transcend culture, and that's where supernatural ministry happens, and that's where leaders rise, and that's where things I think are going to shift for the church.
Yeah. That's great. Brian, thank you for today. Thanks for joining this conversation.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. It's been great.
Okay, so we just had that great conversation with Brian Emmet. And first of all, it's always great to talk to Brian. He's got a depth, but then also a calmness that makes it so easy to kind of learn and grasp things. He's your family member. But I think this is kind of an interesting conversation for you as you put yourself in the role of being what you are, which is a younger growing leader. As you sit and you listen to all that, like, did it give you hope? Was it more like putting into perspective things that you already knew? Or were there like anything that was like earth shattering?
I think it's all of it. I think the conversation of worldview, or like, and not like Christian worldview versus secular worldview, but like what's valued, that shifting, I think is helpful, because it is like my generation very much does come at things of just like, well, this is my truth. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. And I've always struggled with it, where it's like, yes, it's about me and my identity and like what's true to me, but it's also how I fit in the world. And the best way to do that isn't to come at it from me, but it's really about the community as a whole, or the church as a whole. Me as a part of a society, a city, a neighborhood, a country. a citizen of the world, one would say. But so I think that's really important to that shift. Realizing that shift has happened culturally, I think, is really important for me and then for my generation. And then I think we know technology has shifted things culturally. I think we're still figuring out how it's shifted. As you guys were talking, one of the things that came up for me specifically, I was talking about the pandemic and being home for long periods of time. 20 years ago, even, you didn't have phones that you were absorbed in. And I don't know about you, but my phone tells me how much time I spend on it a day. And it's like a shockingly high number. And so as
like 20 minutes.
yeah, 20 minutes times a lot.
Okay.
And I mean, some of it too is not accurate because like Google Maps and those kinds of,
you don't have to explain
functional
yourself to
apps.
me.
But it is interesting. Like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, even, there wasn't this time suck of like 2, 3, 4, 5 hours a day that pulls you away, polarizes you from other people into your own world of like, and it used to be video games. And like, that was like, there was such disdain about like, oh, you're spending too much time playing video games. But now it's actually in your pocket, in your face. And it's totally socially acceptable to spend 5 hours a day on your phone, sometimes more. I think that's a really big cultural change that's happened, especially as we're talking about post-Christian America. Like, it's anything that takes us away from Jesus is hard and shifts culture and shifts the dynamics in the church. And it shifts things politically because, again, it becomes about the things that we care about, the things that we value, the justice we want to see served, whether it's right or wrong. But they're all things that are polarizing in the kingdom. Whereas in the kingdom, like, there is justice in the kingdom. Like, he mourns with those who mourn and he weeps with those who weeps. But it's his justice being served, not ours. And he's the judge, not us. But we want to play all of the roles and we want it done our way. And so I think that's just I think that's a great conversation that we've been having.
To have you say that right now is really great because you just talked about all the big differences and all the very vivid things that are so weighty and dynamic. And yet, then the answer that I thought came out so clearly in today's episode was that there's an answer to all of it in the cross of Christ.
Yes.
Like at the cross, every older person who is filled with a lot of insight, a lot of wisdom, a lot of perspective, and maybe some callousness and maybe some tiredness. The truth is that the way to engage a next generation isn't judgmentally or forcefully or to try to dominate or to try to criticize, but to come to the cross, to lay your life down, to follow Jesus, to take up your cross, to deny yourself, not go with what feels good, but take on the form of a servant. Let this mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus. And like Brian said, learn to build a partnership, build a servant role of learning to love and be relevant and to help and to lift by following Jesus into that. So the cross doesn't matter how rich you are. The cross means you lay everything down and you follow him, or you walk away as a rich young ruler, even though you're actually a rich older leader. So the cross is the answer for the older generation in this equation. But then for everything you're talking about, the cross is the answer. Because the truth is anytime you find anything that's making it have to be about you, we used to say you're swimming in Lake You. That's death. Like once you get caught into those moments where you've been hurt or this happened to you or this happened to you, which has happened in every generation and every person all around the world, and things are so difficult in so many situations. And even what's happened to you is difficult. But the answer to it is the cross. And when you come to him and you give him everything in your arms, even the hurts, he takes it and he gives you everything in his hands. He spreads his arms wide. And what you get is so much better. And there's redemption, and there's refreshment, and there's restoration, and there's change. But it's the cross of Christ. And many go away sadly. But it's the thing that changes everything. And that's where the two generations come together. It's really right there where Jesus is. But we all want to get into the vivid challenge that you were painting as if it's so much bigger and bigger than Jesus. And of course it's not, is it?
No, it's not. And one of the notes while we were talking, I took down, this is just like what I was typing out. When you follow Jesus, you give up your rights. And that's really what it is. Like for the old generation, for the current generation, for a younger rising generation, it's when we choose to follow Jesus, we're saying, I am all these things in my heart that don't make sense and I'm upset about. I give them to you. Jesus, lead me. And so our right to be angry about these things or wanting these things to change and do it our way have died, and now it's his way for us, which is why that identity piece, I think, is also really important, because which is great. If you haven't listened to our last episode, be sure to listen to our last episode on purpose. But who you're made for is really, really important, and it makes this process easier, because then you kind of know what you're running towards and what you're made for. And so then all this other stuff just becomes distraction, and you can kind of run towards Jesus and like, this is my purpose, this is what I'm made for. And then everything else kind of becomes white noise.
Well, finally, I want to say this. You were saying at the end, well, Jesus does care about justice. I want to say that differently. I want to shout at you. Jesus cares way more about justice than you do, because while you're caught up in just yourself, he loves every single person as much or more than you're sitting there just trying to love yourself. Mm-hmm. And so his capacity and his passion for justice, for everything that's happening in the whole earth, his heart for people will blow you away, including his fighting for justice for you. So that's the crazy part, where you're all caught up in trying to out-justice Jesus. You can't imagine how goofy that is. And that's really the power of what we're talking about in raising and growing leaders, is that the secret to all of this is going to be Jesus. He's really good at it. He was good at it with the 12. He was good at it with the 72. And he's been good at it forever. So that was great today.
Mm-hmm. It was.
See you next time.
I hope so.
I hope so too.